1960s. Formed in 1965, they became highly popular and signed a record deal with RCA for a then unheard of sum of $25,000. Together, their recorded output, including their debut and follow-up albums such as Surrealistic Pillow, After Bathing at Baxter's, Crown of Creation, among others, showcased a group of highly expressive, thoughtful, and adventurous musicians. Their performances displayed a penchant for improvisation not seen in most rock bands at the time. And yesterday, right here in Los Angeles, the Recording Academy honored the group with its Lifetime Achievement Award. But before we bring them out, watch this video.
When the truth is found to be lies, and all the joy within you dies. Don't you want somebody to love?
Amid the highly charged psychedelic haze of the Summer of Love, San Francisco's Jefferson Airplane cut through in a big and powerful way. They did so by bringing the world a compelling and countercultural energy and a series of vivid and sometimes trippy songs that would soon become enduring rock classics, including Somebody to Love and White Rabbit. And those were just two standout songs on the group's acclaimed and massively successful 1967 album, Surrealistic Pillow, that soon transformed Jefferson Airplane into the breakout success story of the entire San Francisco scene. Soon, Marty Balin, Jack Casady, Spencer Dryden, Paul Kantner, Jorma Kaukonen, and Grace Slick became known internationally as a kind of inspired hippie rock collective, one freely exploring an eclectic sound that artfully combined folk, blues, garage rock, and popular songwriting craft with politically charged and sometimes even revolutionary lyrics. Jefferson Airplane's significant place in 60s rock was reflected in the fact that the group would headline perhaps the three best-known festivals of the decade: Monterey, Woodstock, and more infamously, Altamont. Their moment at the epicenter of this musical revolution was over by the end of the decade, as the band began to splinter. There was a second act for some band members when they formed Jefferson Starship in the 70s. Yet the idealistic hippie rock and roll dream that the band conjured up in their time together continues to resonate and live on in the airwaves and in the hearts and minds of a generation that Jefferson Airplane did much to define.
So, would you please help me in welcoming Jorma Kaukonen and Jack Casady? You're still laughing from last night.
I am.
Yeah. So I have to start by asking you guys about last night. You know, coming to Los Angeles, receiving the Lifetime Achievement Award. Tell me what that, Jack. Tell me what that means to you.
It's really great. My late wife Diana used to tell me that when your peer group gives you an award, it's really something special. You know, and we all, there's so many musicians, there's so much playing in so many bands out there in the world. To narrow it all down and then get a presentation like I just watched and an award last night, it's really something special.
Yeah.
And I've always wanted to be a good musician. You know, it's all I really ever wanted to do was play and work on my craft work in an environment that was free to do that.
Mm-hmm.
And that group was different for me. Coming out from the East Coast, which is much more rigid music format in the club world, I said they didn't want to hear original music. When I came out to California, at my pal's request, we had Jorma.
Well, we're going to tell that story.
Yeah,
so.
and so, but that environment, you know, led to last night after being, you know, 57 years in the business.
Yeah.
It was quite something special.
Yeah. Jorma, I think you said something like the music that came from San Francisco in the 60s was more a state of mind than it was necessarily a particular thing or sound.
Well, yeah, in a sense. And I think that if you look at, I'm certainly not a jazz musician, but that spirit of the West Coast jazz thing that was so different, even though I'm an East Coast kid also, we were just a lot freer about stuff. The other thing too is Jack had actually played in bands. He actually knew a lot of, he actually knew how to play. He knew what he was doing, But the rest of us, we were pretty much a bunch of folkies and stuff like that, And as we sort of like got grafted into what was going on, we were unfettered by having to sound like, Paul Revere and the Raiders or whatever. I mean, we could did whatever we did. And as a result, people talk about that nonsensical thing with the so-called competition with LA. That's a bunch of nonsense. It's just a different scene. Because the people that I knew a lot of LA guys down there, and they were like studio quality cats, which I was not, Yeah. So that was the bad news, but the good news was that we were really free to do what we wanted to do, and we rehearsed relentlessly.
You did, yeah.
Relentlessly, 8 hours a day, 10 hours a day, and
So before we get to that, I want to roll the videotape back a little bit and talk about, you guys met in DC. You went to high school together.
Yeah, I was in junior high, and Jorma was a friend of my older brother, Charles Casady, and that's how I met Jorma.
Yeah.
Jorma was in high school, and we were 3 years apart.
he led me astray.
That's what his grandmother always said when I went out. You're not going out with that Casady.
And you eventually had a band. You had a band together.
We did. As a matter of fact, I still have the last we cut a 78.
78.
And we cut it direct to disc.
Yeah, we're way ahead of our time.
Audio file before
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I have the last existing copy of this record. This guy named Phil Covell sort of got our band together. We had a band called The Triumphs. Phil was the singer. It was Magic Key, backed with Symbol of Our Love. And in this band, I was the rhythm guitar player, Jack was the lead guitar player, and he takes a quintessential 50s guitar solo. Lots of room reverb, the whole deal,
That's fantastic.
With my 1958 Telecaster.
Where's that Telecaster?
I wish I had that today.
Oh.
I bought it for $115 with my newspaper route money.
Well done.
400 papers a day.
I'm guessing there's 3/4 of the people here would like to have that Telecaster, as a matter of fact. So, when did you decide to switch to bass?
Well, I started, the first time I got my hands on a bass, it was really funny. Jorma and I we went into this club, and it was on north to East Washington, which wasn't Northwest Washington. And we were, of course, drunk at the time. And we came in and they...
You need to tell about the fake IDs we had.
No, yes, we won't get to that.
Yeah.
In Washington, D.C., you could, at that time, drink at 18, play clubs at 18. And as a matter of fact, I think in New York at the time, you could drink hard liquor at 18. But anyway, you could get into clubs and drink beer, 3.2, at 18. And Jorma's grandfather, take it, Jorma.
Yeah, well, my grandfather was, he was translating Russian air pollution literature for the government, and then that was one of my jobs. I worked for my grandfather typing all the stuff up, and he had an early copy machine, a photocopy machine. So we borrowed his older brother's draft card, put tape over all the information he needed, made copies, typed our own stuff in glue. We had to glue the two together and laminate it. So they could, but the funny thing was, you know,
that was your idea.
That was our idea. You know, they didn't have pictures and ID back then. But anyway, I mean, both of us, it looked like butter wouldn't melt in our mouths, and we were going, yeah, well, I'm 18.
So anyway, we after that period of time, well, actually during that period of time, the first time I laid my hands on a bass, which was a Fender bass that looks like a Telecaster, but the first Fender bass looked that way. We sat in a bar band, and I remember the stage was behind the bar in a half moon shape, like up like that.
It's like half a wedding cake.
And so Jorma played. They had a band set up with drums and a bass and a guitar, which were both Fenders, by the way. And this is 1959, I guess. And we sat in, but I didn't know what I was doing. Well, a couple of years later, after Jorma went off to college in Antioch, a friend of mine, Danny Gatton, who's very well known
The great Danny Gatton.
in Washington, D.C., he was the Wonder Kid. He was a year younger than me, and he was 15 at the time. I think I was 16. And he said, listen, I got a gig in a club. It was summertime. I got a gig in a club 6 nights a week. And of course, then you wore plaid tuxedos, 40 on, 20 off, Sunday afternoon shows. And we did things like Louis Prima and Ray Charles and rockabilly stuff and all of that, you know. And he said, listen, my bass player's sick. He had some terrible, you know, a real disease, and he couldn't make it. And he says, you know anybody can play bass? And I said, no. He says, well, why don't you do the gig? And I said, I've never played bass. He says, how hard can it be? It's only got 4 strings. So that was the beginning. I played the gig, and something clicked with me. Aside from the fact that my monetary influx increased exponentially, I just liked the tone. There was something about that. I don't think I was a great enough guitar player to move too much forward, but somewhere in this realm of all my musical influences, I love the bass. And what's interesting, I was asked a little recently when I did a review of who my electric bass influences were. I said I didn't really have any because there were hardly any around. They were just starting to be used in rockabilly, and I think James Brown's guy was the first one to use it for R&B, and that really changed the sound, the way the syncopation came into the music. Because all the other music, Ray Charles, all that was all done on stand-up bass. So anyway, that's what started me off in playing bass guitar, and in 1960 I ordered up, because the regular precision was a little big for my hands, and Fender had just come out with a brand new bass called Jazz Bass. It had a little more narrow neck, nut at the neck, and 2 pickups on it, and I got that, and it worked out perfectly.
Yeah. This is one of the best things, just as an aside to the audience about talking to guitar players, is you guys may not remember anything about any particular period, but you'll remember exactly what guitar you were playing in any particular moment.
First things first.
I love that. So what artists were you here at, at this time as you're starting to play in clubs and pick up gigs or whatever, but what artists are you hearing that, are kind of beginning to inspire you?
When we had our little band together, there was a lot of rockabilly stuff.
Yeah.
So I love Gene Vincent and Buddy Holly and Scotty Moore and that stuff that was coming out. That really nitty-gritty stuff that was coming out of the South. With Jim Burton, I'd watch him on Ricky Nelson, trying to figure out what he was doing.
Yeah.
Stuff like that.
Yeah.
But in my world in the bass playing, I really listened to most of the jazz players, Scotty LaFleur and Charles Mingus and all those guys. And in the early 60s, I started listening to a lot of jazz. Not that I was ever good at playing jazz or playing the style of jazz, but I love the interaction and the interplay. And I think that's what we carry to the airplane, with that interaction. The instruments seem very natural in the conversation, and then what we do with Hot Tuna, particularly in this kind of format. That interaction always intrigued me. And when I was really young, my father, Dr. William R. Casady, and Jorma and I would go over and listen to his hi-fi, Heathkit hi-fi setup in the rec room in the basement. And he belonged to the American Jazz Society, and he would get records every every month, but he loved music. And the guys that I was interested in was like Big Spiderbeck and Charlie Will Morton and small combo bands, Eddie Condon out of the late 20s and 30s. That's what I was listening to in the 50s, even though my contemporaries like Gene Vincent and Elvis Presley, and all of that was going on at the same time.
Yeah.
Those are the kind of jazz guys. I didn't really like the big band arrangement stuff, but I like the small combos.
Right. And Jorma, you went off to Antioch
I did.
and ran into a guy there who was kind of turned your head as far as guitar playing.
Well, my whole, I'm sort of an anti-intellectual about that kind of stuff, and I just, when I started to play the guitar, I became a guitar player accidentally. I just wanted to sing the songs, so I learned what I needed to do the songs, and that was it. And but I always enjoyed solo guitar players, and I was fortunate to hear both Sabikis and Segovia play, and a bunch of guys like that, and Charlie Bird and this and that. And when I went off to Antioch, I just we met with the first Joan. Oh, that Joan Baez stuff, but that's not really finger picking, but it's finger style. Well, anyway, so when I got to Antioch, I met this guy named Ian Buchanan. He's unfortunately passed away for a long time, and Ian's muse was Lonnie Johnson. Lonnie Johnson's more of a jazz guitar player, all he did was also, that stuff was way over my head, but Ian was a buddy. He wasn't a student of it, he was a buddy of Reverend Gary Davis's. And he turned me on to the Reverend, and there was just something about that music, which is kind of funny to think about, sort of a non-observant Jew like myself, one day playing all this Baptist gospel music, but for some reason it seemed to make perfect sense. And Reverend Davis, and I'm sure you've thought about this, he really needs to be recognized one of the great figures of 20th century American music, and not just because of the guitar, because of a lot of things. Anyway, so I got a couple. There weren't a lot of albums available at that time. I got the Harlem Street Singer on Prestige, and the Pink Anderson, Gary Davis on Riverside, and I had the Brownie McGee, that 8-inch Folkways record, and I listened to those 3 records, and only those 3 for about 3 years, and that's what I just immersed myself in. And then I got an Antioch co-op job shortly thereafter in New York. I was an attendant in a hospital, in the rehabilitation hospital on 34th Street, and just hanging out in the village and stuff like that, 60 and 61, and just playing relentlessly and checking the scene out, and that really changed my life. Ian changed my life in a huge way, and that's kind of where all that stuff started for me.
I have to interrupt here. This is great. Now, when he went up to work at this hospital, because it was Antioch, and you worked 3 months and then went to school 3 months.
We learned how to work, Jack.
You learn how to work,
If I never empty another bedpan in my life, it'll be
And then I was around 16. The Dick Spotswood and the Washington label they had kind of rediscovered Son House and Mississippi John Hurt and a bunch, and then you had that folk revolution that Dave Van Ronk and the Holy Model Rounders and a number of white middle class kids started listening to older folk music, the Harry Smith collections and things that people started to dig up, listen to. So I took a train up, Jorma was up there and we were talking, and I said, I'll come up to New York. So I'm 16, I take my first trip out of Washington, D.C. Take a train up to New York City, Penn Station, come out of the subway, and my intro to New York City, to meet you over there and go to all these clubs and see all these guys that we're talking about. This guy comes staggering up out of the subway, and a knife sticking out of his chest, and cloth gun right there in front of him. The guy's on the spot. And welcome to New York.
Welcome to New York.
So then I would go to the various clubs and I got to see Reverend Gary Davis. I got to see Senator Brownie McGee and all these people in the village, and
John Lee.
And John Lee, absolutely. And later on, I got to play a record. Right after John Lee passed away, I got to put a bass track on one of his songs.
Better late than never.
But I was interested in all that folk music. What really interested me was that concept that the guitarist could like Jorma could sit down and play complete music on the guitar, which really appealed to me because a lot of my influences I was talking about from Wine and Board Blues and a couple other songs that we play. A lot of my influences are piano influences, and that I get the voicings off the left hand of the piano. Not as much the guitar influences for when I hear the bass lines and when I'm working with the bass lines. So when we started to figure out how are we going to play this kind of music, like sort of between a bass and a guitar, that a lot of that influence came in through the piano for me.
Sure.
Anyway, that's my New York story.
I love it. So what was it that compelled you to move to the Bay Area?
Well, the sort of short version of that somewhat long story is, Antioch, when I came back after that New York thing, I was not thrown out of Antioch, but I was not encouraged to return. And actually, it's really funny because years later, I got some kind of recognition from him, and I said, I never graduated, because nobody graduates from Antioch, really. But anyway, I said, I wasn't encouraged to return, but what has defined my life, I learned here. What more can you want from any school? But anyway, so my dad was in the service. We were stationed in the Philippines for 6 years. I went out. I went to a Jesuit college out there called the Ateneo de Manila, and a bunch of stuff happened while I was there. Anyway, when I came back, I had all these odd credits in like Thomistic philosophy, Aristotelian logic, As Aristotle would say, if so then, if not, not. But anyway, and so I wanted to go to USF because San Francisco, there were beatniks in San Francisco, and that whole thing really appealed to me. I understand that they occasionally drank and had sex with women and stuff, and that seemed like a good place to go.
And a good Jesuit school.
Of course. But my grades weren't good enough for that, so I wound up at the University of Santa Clara, which is how I wound up in California. And interestingly enough, the first week that I was there, I just got on the campus, there was a little flyer for a hootenanny. Some of us remember what hootenannies were, and there was a place called the Folk Theater at that time, and at that hootenanny, that's the night that I met Janis. A lot of those tapes were floating around. Jerry Garcia, Richmond Talbot, a Blue Ron, Pigpen Ron McKern, and all those guys, and they were all there that first night that I was there, and that's what was going on.
Wow. That's stunning.
It is stunning.
It's stunning.
Who knew? It's kind of like a Grammy Lifetime Achievement Award.
You ended up doing gigs with Janis Joplin.
Yeah, that first, like I said, there's these tapes are now floating around, and if I thought about it, I would have brought you some neat stuff. But we'll talk about that
Okay,
another time.
awesome.
But anyway, so she was there. We're backstage talking, and she needed somebody to accompany her. I'd just come from the East Coast, and I knew a lot of, if not specifically the songs, the style and the stuff that she was emanating from, and so we played together, and it really clicked. I mean, listen, it's one of the most powerful experiences of my life. She was an awesome person and a performer. But anyway, and what a privilege that was. But in any case, so people go, well, you used to accompany Janis. It's not quite that organized. I was down the peninsula, she was in San Francisco. When she would come down the peninsula and need somebody, then she would give me a call. And the famous typewriter tapes we were rehearsing for a gig. How could, she was my ex-wife, may she rest in peace. How could she be there? I mean, it was no big deal, in any case.
Well, the whole thought of music as a business was so completely different. In fact, did you guys, when you were young, maybe even as you had moved to San Francisco, were you conscious that I'm going to make music a career?
I don't think that I thought about it like that because I've never really been career-oriented in that way. Like Chris Smither, great Chris Smither says about this the show we call the business we call the show, as Roland Thompson would say, is I fell into it when I was a kid and I never fell out of it.
That makes sense.
Yeah.
Did you have a sense when you would have the opportunity to play with Janis that this was a truly unique talent?
Absolutely, no question about it.
Yeah. So to kind of run the timeline forward a little bit, tell me how you met Paul and Marty.
Oh, well, Marty was later. This is great. So here I am at the University of Santa Clara. Now, the year that I was there was the first year was a co-ed school, and the upperclassmen that were there, because I was a junior at that time, they were upset that there were women in the campus. I've been living in New York by myself. Have you guys lost your minds? So I'm walking down, so I was definitely one of the honest people. I'm walking down on the campus, and I see this guy with long hair and a beard, which was not happening at all yet. And we looked at each other, we realized that whoever we were, that we were in some way kindred spirits. This guy's name was Bob Kinsey. He just retired as the head of the Marine Biology Department at the University of Hawaii. But anyway, and his roommate the year before was Paul Kantner. So he said, I know this guy. You got to meet him. So we went to Santa Cruz with Paul. Paul was a surfer dude at the time. Now, I don't know if he ever actually went surfing or not, because I didn't see that. But he lived on a beach. There was a surfboard propped up against this little shack. And he was wearing board shorts. That's how I got That's how I met Paul. And then later on, and Paul had his whole folk scene going on. At the time he had an act. He played 12-string guitar, 6-string, and banjo, a 5-string banjo. And then he started putting together some folk groups because he was always into vocal harmonies. And then when he moved to San Francisco, made the big move away from San Jose. And then he called me up one day and said, you got to meet this guy, we're doing this, we're doing that. And that's the first time I met Marty, was at the Matrix.
And they auditioned you at the Matrix.
They did.
I heard that part of the attraction was that they had some technology that you were not
Well, this is
aware of.
laughable by today's standards.
Yeah.
That Ken Kesey was there, and he had an Echoplex, which was a tape delay thing. Anyway, and I just plugged my guitar into it, sort of like a poor man's looping device. And I went, whoa, this is unbelievable. We played and had fun, and
went from there.
There you go.
So obviously the original, the original incarnation of the band, Bob Harvey,
Correct.
was playing bass.
Jerry Bellicone was playing drums.
And Bob had come out of a sort of an acoustic roots music.
Yeah, he's a bluegrass guy.
Bluegrass guy. At some point, you guys wanted something different.
Right. I can't remember exactly how this happened, but it did happen. And of course, my first thought was this illustrious gentleman, resplendent in his sartorial magnificence. And so I called him up, and we had this manager at the time, and I said, look, here's what's going on. And whether we work or not, we get $50 a week.
I said, you're
what's
on.
not to like? So they flew him out. I'll never forget, I went to the airport and I picked him up. They didn't have security back then, met him at the gate. And my first words, as I recall, you better, because I never heard him play bass. You better be able to play that.
And tell him what you picked me up in.
Let's see, I believe it was
Verbal Sunbeam.
Yeah, the old Sunbeam. Yeah, the old Sunbeam.
So your first time, were you aware of the Airplane? Were you aware of their music?
Well, the Airplane was, this he described the forming of it, which was July 1965. I came out to 2 months later, and I think the first gig was October of 65. So
Actually, it was Friday, August the 13th.